Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. I'm sorry I didn't get anything up last week, but I would like to start a four-part series that I'll do 2 parts this week and 2 parts next week on Israel getting water while they were in the desert. And the first session today will come from Exodus 17 where Moses struck the rock. Hopefully on Friday I'll get it uploaded. The second part will come from Numbers 20 where Moses was supposed to speak to the rock, but he struck it instead, and yet water still came out. The third part, we were going to look at the repercussions, particularly on Moses, also on Aaron, for his actions of striking the rock instead of speaking to it. And then the fourth part, I'd like us to look and examine some of the lessons that Israel was supposed to learn as they wandered in the desert and saw God providing bread and water for them, and how ultimately Jesus fulfilled that by declaring himself to be the living bread and the living water. So right now, let's read Exodus 17, verses 1 to 7. Then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses, and said, "Give us water, that we may drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses, and said, "Why now have you brought us up from Egypt, to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do to this people? A little more, and they will stone me." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Pass before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He named the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Now this is by no means the first miracle that Israel has seen, and even in the short while since they left Egypt, they have seen a number of miracles. They witnessed the 10 plagues that God did against the Egyptians. In chapter 14, they come out of Egypt and they cross the Red Sea miraculously. In chapter 15, they come to Marah and they can't drink the water, so God makes it so they can. In chapter 16, they have no food, so God gives them manna and quail. And then here we are in chapter 17, they have no water again, and they complain again. And on the one hand, I can read this and be quite critical of the Israelites because of all they had seen God do. But on the other hand, I have to recognize they are in a desert, they have no water. That's a pretty basic life need. How would I handle that? And really, what example in my life could I turn to that would indicate that I would show more faith? Because when it comes right down to it, as I look back on my life, I have never been out of water, and yet I've had many times where I have complained. So the truth would be that I have grumbled many times over far less critical things than what they are grumbling over here. Verses 5 and 6 are very critical to this passage, where God tells Moses, "Pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. And behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb." Almost every translation reads it this way, where God indicates that he will stand on the rock, and Moses is supposed to strike the rock. That's very significant, that God does not indicate, and I'm lacking a little bit in the fact that we're working off the English language and not the original Hebrew, but God does not seem to indicate that he stands beside the rock and Moses is to strike the rock. But God in fact indicates that he stands on the rock and Moses is to strike the rock and that water will come out. I won't pretend to understand everything here, but I would say that the significance of this will grow in part 2 as we look at Numbers 20, and in part 3 as we look at the consequence for Moses disobeying God in Numbers 20. And for now, we can suffice to say that there is a lot more to this than immediately meets the eye in Exodus 17. What is going on with God standing on the rock and with Moses being commanded to strike the rock? I think the true significance of that would be hard to see here in this passage alone, but it will develop as we make our way through this little study. In verse 7, it says that Moses named the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" And again, in this passage, in this reading, there's now been a number of times where the people have complained, and in each case up until now, God does not appear to be very angry with the people in their complaint, but he's dealing with their complaints. He's continuing to provide for them, and yet Moses gives a word of commentary at the end of this in verse 7, saying that he named the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel and because they tested the Lord. So they're not just complaining. Moses understands they are testing, saying, in fact, is the Lord among us or not? Are we here on our own, or is God in fact with us? This is different than just saying, I'm thirsty and I don't know where I will find water. There's more going on here as well. And in other passages, this comes back into play. In Deuteronomy 6:16, Moses is instructing the people as he's looking at the end of his life, at the end of the 40 years of wanderings, and the book of Deuteronomy is all about remembering. And he says in chapter 6, verse 16, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massah." So clearly the test in Exodus 17 is about more than water. Psalm 95 verse 8 says, "Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as in the day of Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me. They tried me, though they had seen my work." And the writer of Hebrews quotes these verses in Hebrews 3, verses 7 to 9. And so back in Exodus 17, this may be a culmination of testing and disbelief on the part of the Israelites, as this is now, what would it be, the fifth or sixth time where they have had a need, and yet they've grumbled and complained. Or it may be an increase in disbelief despite God's continued provision. And if this is the fifth or sixth time of complaint, there would also be 5 or 6 times of God's miraculous provision. Not provision in any ordinary sense, but to any objective eye, they would say that God has performed a miracle for our protection, for our provision. And as they continue to complain, the affront before God becomes more and more severe. Either way, whether this is a culmination or whether this is an increase in disbelief, God takes this very seriously, where he judges Israel to be saying, in effect, is the Lord among us or not? It's not just about water. It's about the presence of God. There's no water? Fine. But can there be no water and still an acknowledgement that God is there? That becomes the question then for the Israelites. And so for us today, I read a passage like this and I have to acknowledge that complaining is a very dangerous thing. Because it's very hard for me to judge my own heart. I can judge someone else's complaining spirit easier than I can judge my own. That's hard too, because I hear their words, I hear their tone, I read their body language, and yet I don't know their heart, truly. But the truth is the same for me. I hear my own words. I see my own actions, and I can possibly even read my intent on my body language. But do I know my own heart? Because I can deceive myself just as easily as I can deceive others. My complaint might be a momentary lapse, which in itself is not justified, but it might also be a reflection of a habitual mindset of entitlement, where I believe that God owes me a certain quality of life, and if I do not see that, then I'm angry and I throw a temper tantrum. And by doing that, I end up reversing the roles, where instead of me being submissive to God, I expect him to be submissive to me and to my demands. And that is a very scary place to be. So what is my heart? Where is my heart? I justify my complaining. But is my heart right before God? Or would God say, you have no right to talk to me that way? And by your words and by your complaining, you are in effect saying, is God with me or not? And we must never question the presence of God. We must never question the faithfulness of God. That stands apart from any circumstance. We must believe that and act accordingly. God takes that seriously. May God encourage you, but may God challenge you to search out your heart and see where your attitude and where your mind is as you walk before Him today. Lord bless you.